1992, we had almost all of the GNU system, hundreds of components. Now, some of them I wrote myself. Some of them I recruited other people to write. Some of them, by luck, someone else wrote a free program to do that job. And in some cases, I persuaded somebody to liberate a proprietary program. For instance, in BSD. BSD existed in 1983. It was a proprietary modified version of Unix developed by the University of California at Berkeley. Well, I went there in 1985 and I said, please separate your code from AT&T's code and release your code as free software so that we can use it in GNU. And a few years later, they did. So in 1992, we had everything except one major essential component, the kernel. This is the component that allocates the computer's resources to all the other programs you run. We had started developing a kernel in 1990, but that project didn't work out very well. It needs a lot of work. And it took 6 years to get a test version to run. I chose a design that was so advanced that it became a kind of research project. Well, what can I say? Nobody wins them all. In any case, we didn't have to wait for it, because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had written a proprietary kernel called Linux, liberated it. He released it under the GNU General Public License. And that made it free software. So the combination of Linux plus all the rest of the components that were waiting to be the GNU system was a complete operating system. The first complete operating system for that complete free operating system since the beginning of the 80s or so. Thus, the liberation of Linux was an important contribution to the free software community. But the people who combined Linux with all the other pieces were so focused on this one component that they perceived all the rest of the system as a small add-on. Somewhat distorted perceptions. And they began talking about this whole combination as if it were Linux. And other people imitated that, and that's why people think that this whole system was developed mainly by Mr. Torvalds starting in 1991, which is not true. And the result is that you will see lots of discussion of the GNU system, which calls it Linux and gives us, the hundreds of us who worked on GNU before 1992, no credit at all. Well, that's not nice, so please call the system GNU plus Linux. Give us equal mention, that's all we ask. But this is not just a matter of being fair to us. That's not really so important after all. The issue of credit is not the most important ethical issue in life. But there's something much more important at stake in your decision of what name to use for this system. Your freedom is at stake. Indirectly, of course. Directly, the name doesn't change the thing. So, of course, it doesn't directly affect your freedom, but it does indirectly. For instance, if you call roses onions, that won't change the roses, but it will confuse cooks. They'll want an onion and they'll buy this funny onion and it won't taste right. And in the long term, you might change the roses because people who grow roses will start breeding varieties of roses that smell and taste like onions to satisfy the confused cooks. The words you choose determine the message you communicate which influences people's thoughts, which later on guide their actions. So it makes a difference what you say. Since 1983, the name GNU has been associated with our ideas of freedom and community, ethical ideas. But the name Linux is not. The name Linux is associated with a different philosophy, that of Mr. Torvalds. And what is it? Well, he doesn't believe that you deserve freedom in using software. He doesn't believe he deserves freedom in using software. He says he's happy to use non-free software as long as it's convenient and reliable. So he has a totally different philosophy based on different values. Well, he has a right to his views. But what happens when people erroneously credit him with developing the GNU system is they admire him tremendously and they copy his views and they don't even think about ours. And the result is they don't learn to value their own freedom. They don't even consider it. They just follow Torvalds. And the result of that is the day when we have to fight for our freedom, they're not with us because they don't see anything to fight for. They're happy as long as they get convenient, reliable software. And when it does something nasty, they don't draw a deep lesson from that. They don't say it's doing something nasty because somebody else controls it and through it has power over me. No, they just say, he should do a better job. You see, freedom is frequently threatened. To keep it, we must defend it. You can see that looking at the history of the world, including the history of Brazil. But in most areas of life, the debate about human rights has lasted decades or centuries, which is plenty of time to arrive at conclusions about what human rights people deserve and spread them around the world. This doesn't mean we always win, but sometimes this enables us to defend human rights. But computing is a very new area of life. Even in the most advanced countries, it's less than 20 years that most people do computing. And in other countries, it's less. That's not much time to have a debate about what human rights a user deserves in using a program. But in fact, there has never really been a debate because almost all users started with proprietary software, surrounded by other users of proprietary software, and they didn't know that there was any other possibility. So effectively, they took for granted that proprietary software is an acceptable alternative, which means they let the proprietary developers dictate the answer to that question. What human rights do you deserve in running a program? And their answer is effectively none at all. They say they can impose any conditions they like, and you just have to accept them. So, who tries to start a debate? We in the free software movement believe we have identified 4 human rights that software users deserve. They are the 4 essential freedoms that define free software. But when we try to bring these ideas to the attention of the users of the GNU system, we encounter 2 obstacles. First of all, they don't know they're using the GNU system. They think it's Linux and that it was all started by Mr. Torvalds and comes from his vision of life. So when they see the articles where we explain this philosophy, they say to themselves, why should I read what those GNU fanatics write? I'm a Linux user. I'm proud to follow the pragmatic ideas of Mr. Torvalds. I won't read it. Pragmatic, by the way, when people say that a certain philosophy is pragmatic, that tends to mean deciding important long-term issues based on short-term benefits. Well, what they say to themselves is ironic, because really they're using the GNU system and they don't know it. Suppose they knew it. Suppose they said to themselves, I'm a GNU/Linux user, and this is an article from the developers of GNU. They are the people who made this system. I'd better read it. And then we would have a chance to try to convince them, and maybe we would succeed. So it makes a difference whether they heard you call the system GNU/Linux. Then they might know we're using the GNU system, and they might listen to what we say. But there's another obstacle. Since 1998, most discussion of free software doesn't use the term free software. Most of the people say open source. Why is that? During the 90s, as the GNU/Linux system spread among technical people, many of them recommended it because of practical benefits. They hadn't thought about the issue in terms of freedom, so they didn't discuss that, but they recommended it to their friends because it was powerful, reliable, efficient, flexible, and cheap. So there were two political camps within the free software community. There was the free software movement, those of us who said, we're doing this because we want to live in freedom. And then there was the other camp, the people like Mr. Torvalds, who